Welcome to the Unlist. Once again, filming from the Void 2.0, I guess you could say. This is going to be a bit of a controversial video because it covers a topic that a lot of people in the online fragrance community, especially people who are, I guess you could say, knee-deep in batch code and vintage hysteria, a subject that they would consider almost to be blasphemy. Like, this isn't a thing, it doesn't exist. To speak of this is basically to, like, spit on the Holy Grail or something. But, you know, I don't care. I gotta be real about stuff, and I'm just going to say it as it is. Reformulations that actually improved the fragrance. Again, there are a very vocal minority of people who think this doesn't exist. That the original version of everything is the best version. The first version of everything, we could go even further to a more extreme, where the first bottling run of the first formula, so like the day one bottles that I always joke about, you got to have the day one bottle or else you don't have the real thing. You got to be first in line, camping out in line at your local Macy's to get that first bottle release, or else you've never really truly smelled the fragrance, right? That whole thing. Those people just provide me endless entertainment. But, you know, on the flip side of that, on the opposite end of that spectrum, is reformulations that improve a fragrance, that make it smell better, right? Those do exist, arguably. Now, depending on your metric of better, you could say better equates to more sales, maybe, equates to more popular fragrance, perhaps, or you could say better from an artistic, subjective perspective of, well, I subjectively think, based on my opinion and my taste, that the reformulation is better than the older version of the fragrance I had before. That's fine. We're not going to debate how we're defining better here. We're just talking about where a lot of people have discussed when a fragrance feels better in their formulation compared to the original. So now, in every fragrance I name in this video, where I say the reformulation is better than the original, I'm not saying this unilaterally. So let's not get it twisted. All the people with the pitchforks and torches and the nooses already tied, ready to throw me over a tree, let's not get too violent too quickly here. When I say improvement or better, I'm saying for a stated reason. I'm saying according to what I've heard, and I can see the case being made for it. You can still very much believe that the older bottles are better. In some cases, I like both older and newer for different reasons. So I kind of play the devil's advocate where I'm like, yeah, the older one is better for this reason and the newer one's better for that reason. But the whole point of this video is to discuss fragrances where it has been noted that the reformulation is better for a lot of people than the older ones. No particular order. Let's get started. Well, let's start off with newer reformulations, not ones made 10, 15 years ago, okay? So, let's talk about Acqua di Gio, the original 1996 men's Acqua di Gio Poro, okay? This is a fragrance that has not quite hit 30 years old. It still currently stands as the most sold fragrance of all time. Like, I do believe it is the most sold men's fragrance of all time. I don't know if it's the most sold fragrance, period. I think Chanel No. 5 may still have more bottles in the world than Acqua di Gio does, but I do believe Acqua di Gio is the most sold men's fragrance of all time. Now, I'm not talking about current sales. If we talk about current sales, then Dior Sauvage is the top of the crop. Dior Sauvage sells more bottles every second of every minute of every day than anything else on the planet. More people are buying bottles of this blue stuff than they are anything. But just in total production numbers, Acqua di Gio still sits at number 1 of the most bottles sold. And it's had 30 years, obviously, to do that. So it's had some time. But in late 2024, early 2025, they did a refresh of the original. Something that a lot of people were deathly afraid of, because obviously Acqua di Gio is a landmark aquatic fragrance. It was perfumed by both Alberto Morillas, Jacques Cavalier-Belletrud, and I think Anne Filippo as well. And she typically doesn't get named on the men's one. Typically it's Alberto Morillas gets named, but some sites name both Jacques Cavalier and Alberto Morillas. They both had a hand in that fragrance. But point is, that was a high watermark for the aquatic genre and went on to inspire dozens, if not hundreds of copycat fragrances. Everything from Light Blue, Dolce & Gabbana, Izod by Philips Van Heusen, Blue Seduction, Antonio Banderas was claimed to be an unused mod of that project. To some extent, Polo Blue. Not really super similar though. So yeah, tons and tons and tons. So the 2025 bottles, people were saying, oh, it's just a package refresh. It's not actually a reformulation. They just decided to take away the frosted glass and do the bottom half clear, the top half frosted, because they've been moving to that ever since they rebooted Profumo as Parfum, which is a different fragrance. It's not the same. Then they rebooted the Eau de Parfum, which had only been out 2 years. And they already rebooted that to have a different bottle type. So naturally, it comes time for the original Eau de Toilette to receive the same treatment. And like the other two, it wasn't just a bottle change. Like the other two, it was a full reform. So what's changed? Well, for one, the reason for the reformulation is not necessarily because they wanted to change the way it smelled. You have to understand, a bestseller like Acqua di Gio doesn't need to be tweaked for sales. But unfortunately, white floral materials were banned. And those white floral materials were in Acqua di Gio. Okay, so I think Liliol was banned outright, and hydroxycitronellol was restricted. So I could be wrong. It could be Lirol, but I think it's Liliol that was banned. But they could not use as much of the hydroxycitronellol anymore. So they had to build out a different heart and base that complied with new regulations while maintaining the Acqua di Gio smell. That is a tall order, honestly. But if anyone is going to be able to pull that off, it would be Alberto Morillas, since he's had 30 years working on this range, right? So he did the reformulation by himself. Jacques Cavalier-Belletrud is now under the LVMH umbrella. He's doing Louis Vuitton fragrances, so he's not available to really do anything for anyone else outside of LV. So he's just strictly LV now. So Alberto Morillas has done most of the modern flankers actually by himself. So it's smoother, it's rounder, a little more plush, and even though it is still like 95% the same recognizable opening, same recognizable citruses, persimmon, salty aquatic notes, but since they were not allowed to use as much of the white floral material, they had to sub with some different musk choices. And by beefing up those musk choices to replace the heart notes that were missing, they in turn created a slightly rounder, more musky, plush version of Acqua di Gio that honestly smells better. It smells more refined, okay? It is slightly sweeter, but it is not sweeter because it has ethyl maltol in it or it has more sugary materials. It's sweeter because the musks are sweeter. Because musks can sometimes have a certain sweetness to them, a certain plushness to them, a rounded feel that comes across like sweetness, even though it's not actually sweetness. So I still love the original Acqua di Gio. I still have tons of the original Acqua di Gio. But I'm happy with the new one. I think it's an improvement, honestly. For most people, it's more contemporary because those white floral notes that were in the original were pretty amped up and pretty not sharp in an acrid sense, but they were just very blunt. They were not smooth. And a lot of people these days, whether they're vintage enthusiasts or modern fragrance enthusiasts, they don't tend to like harshness in a fragrance. They like smoothness, whether we're talking smooth sandalwood, oak moss, or smooth white musks. You make a fragrance smoother, it's going to be an improvement for most people. You know, old Polo was smoother than new Polo, right? So same thing. This is the reverse of that. New Acqua di Gio is smoother than old, and that's an improvement for a lot of people. Next fragrance on the list. This one's going to be debatable, but I will give the pros and cons. But Pasha de Cartier from 1992. The new bottles are an improvement on the old bottles, just in terms of overall balance and versatility of the fragrance. Because Pasha de Cartier was designed to be a signature fragrance. It was designed to be the next thing for men that was replacing Santos. Even though Santos didn't go away, it was replacing it as the new modern men's signature fragrance. So when you think of a signature fragrance, a one fragrance that's the only fragrance a guy uses, you tend to think it has to be balanced, even keeled, it has to be centered. It can't be too one way, to the other, too fresh, too aromatic, too musky, too mossy, too floral. It can't be too anything. It's got to be nice and balanced. And the original Pasha de Cartier, which is very good fragrance, was very heavy on spices, oak moss, and real sandalwood because it could afford to use real Mysore sandalwood. Those early Pasha de Cartier bottles did have real Mysore in them. They also had a lot of oak moss in them. And they were wonderful. They were gorgeous, plush, rich. They were the kind of, I want to say, quintessential semi-oriental fougere, the term we used to use for those sort of fougere amber crossover fragrances. We would call them semi-oriental because they weren't full Shalimar, right? They weren't full Taboo. They were in the middle somewhere. Bois de Portugal was like that. Tiffany for Men was like that. Super Fragrance by Etienne Agenet was like that. One of the earliest examples, Pierre Cardin, was like the first one to do that, was very much like that. So that whole semi-oriental style where you take fougere and you splice in amber, splice in sandalwood spices, build it up into a more redolent style fougere. That was very popular in the late 80s, early 90s. And Pasha was kind of right in on that, right on the heels, actually, of jazz, right on the heels of that stuff. But the consequence is very heavy fragrance, right? And the top notes in that fragrance, which included bergamot and mint, a very nice mint note, lavender and geranium, tend to get squashed out by the base notes, right? Even in the very well-preserved bottles where the top notes are still there, tend to get squashed out. And I have the deep vintage bottles and I love them because I love the sandalwood. As a perfume connoisseur and collector and enthusiast, as a weirdo, I love the heavy sandalwood. I love the oak moss in those old bottles. But when I smelled the more recent Pasha de Cartier, which has the newly redesigned bottle with a different cap, a little light bulb went off in my head. I'm like, yeah, you know what? Even though the vintage snobs and the material snobs about the sandalwood would decry this and poo-poo it and call it a shadow of its former self and all these derided remarks and stuff, all this nastiness and hate, right? Because people apparently love to fill their hobbies full of hatred. I mean, I don't know. I don't like putting a bunch of negative emotions into anything that I enjoy. That kind of ruins it for me. I try to keep it positive, but all the hatred and all the, you know, the nagging and naysaying, and I'm like, but you know what? For someone who doesn't care about materials, doesn't care about historic periods of time, well, this is a vintage early 90s fragrance, blah, 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 blah. They're just looking for a balanced, signature-worthy, classic fougere style, right, that has the lavender and the geranium, still has oak moss, still has tonka, still has all the prerequisite materials that qualify the fougere naming, right? Still has the spice, but it's much lighter now. Much lighter. Obviously, they can't use real sandalwood anymore, so they use either polysantol or javanol or something similar. They can't use a lot of oak moss anymore. What little oak moss they can use, if they're using any, they got to pad out with a vernal, but they've turned down, even the vernal is turned down, so it has more of a hay-like dry down, like a what? Like a what? Proper fougere, like an actual classic fougere. The newer one has a more hay-like sort of dry down, and the lavender, geranium, the spices, and the mint notes are allowed to share more of the limelight. They get more time on stage, right? Whereas the old bottles, and again, I love the old bottles, but the old bottles, that heavy-handed sandalwood and oak moss would just really muscle everything else out. So you'd get the top notes for like the first 5 minutes with the old bottles. You get the mint, lavender, geranium, you get the bergamot, you get all that stuff in the very opening. But then 5 minutes later, it's just sandalwood, oak moss, spices, just, you know, tonka, heavy. And I'm like, well, Pasha has the Parfum for that now. If you want that kind of heavy, woody, sort of sandalwood, plush, amber note type of thing, they've got the Parfum for that now. So I can understand why they would lighten up the original. And even though, like I said, I love it, the new one is honestly, for more people, the new one's going to be better, because it's going to be more versatile, more signature worthy. They're not going to have to think about wearing something else when it's too hot outside, or if they're trying to dress down. And the old one was more of a dress up fragrance. The new one, like I said, you can dress it down. It's a little lighter, a little fresher. It's a little more even spirited. I do think it's an improvement. Now, moving on. Now we have, this one's really going to ruffle feathers. This one's really going to ruffle feathers. But you know, I don't really care. Like I said, I can block people, so it's not a problem. You start throwing, some of y'all throw slurs at me and stuff. You get really, really, really just crass, and you guys get like troglodyte levels of anti-intellectual, you know, like, I'm just trying to figure out what you do, where you live. How can you come from a place like that with that level of negativity, right? Over bottles of smelly water. Like, I can't figure it out. So I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this one, but Chanel Antaeus. And I love deep vintage. I've smelled it too. Again, older bottles were very heavy on castoreum. Okay, they had more styrax, more benzoin in them. They definitely had more eugenol because they had a bigger clove note in them. They had a bigger carnation note, rather. And they were just very big, heavy, leathery, sour, woody. And it was meant to be a woody, aromatic chypre, and that is what Jacques Polch meant it to be. So the original fragrance from the 80s, and I guess early 90s too, it fits the assignment. It is Antaeus as it's supposed to be. But, here's the big but. The newer bottles, where they have rebalanced it, they have turned down the castoreum. They have turned down the styrax notes. They have turned down that sour leather portion, and they have allowed that compressed floral heart to shine a little more. The slight aldehydic opening, it was never a big aldehyde bomb. It's not number 5, guys, but the slight aldehydic opening, it shines more, and the fragrance just comes across a little more sheer, a little woodier, right? And you want your woody aromatic chypres to be woody, correct? The old Antaeus, great as it is, and again, I love it. I've got an old bottle with the silver button on it, but as great as it is, the castoreum sort of steals the show. The fragrance was never really an oak moss bomb. It was always more about musks. Antaeus has always been more about musks. But the new version, not being as musky, it has just this more black suit, black tie, office. Like, I feel like with the new Antaeus that it's more like you're an actual power broker on Wall Street. You're an actual top flight lawyer. You're an actual captain of industry when you wear it. The old one was just like leather chaps and barroom and mechanical bulls and Bee Gees playing, and early 80s, late 70s, we still had a little bit of disco lingering around, okay, Village People. It just, the old one felt very brusque and hirsute and borderline surly, right? It was the least Chanel smelling Chanel men's fragrance I think we'll ever see, because everything after Antaeus, including Egoist and Platinum Egoist and Allure, were much more refined, much more smooth, much more Chanel, classic Chanel. But that original Antaeus was just a gut punch. It was a big old gut punch. And again, I like that. All right, I do. I have it. But the new ones with the black button, they definitely feel more Chanel to me. The fragrance has been steered towards a style that is more coherent with the overall Chanel aesthetic, with the blending, the smoothness, the sheerness. You know, it's no longer the black sheep, is what I'm trying to say. It still has a black bottle, yes, but it's no longer the black sheep of the family. And that is why I think, again, for a lot of people, especially people who were not around in the 80s and wearing the original, people who are coming into Chanel nowadays or the last 10, 15 years, whatever, the more modern version of Antaeus just feels more balanced and feels more wearable for more people. And again, I know the gatekeepers and all that are going to come out and they're going to take names and they're going to come after and they're going to swear blood oaths of revenge and go Klingon mode or whatever. And I'm like, okay, fine. This is, your whole existence is based around your hobby of collecting old fragrances, so I understand. I'm basically attacking your identity by saying that the new version is better than the old version, because you made your whole identity about this. I get it. But, like, I just think 90% of people are going to think the new one is more balanced creation. And, of course, there are many Chanels where that is not the case. There are many Chanels where the reformulation is inferior to the original. Obviously, the original version of Egoist was perfect, absolute masterpiece. The older version of Allure Homme was better than the current one, hands down, with the smooth cap without the little ring around it. Older versions of the original Chanel Pour Monsieur from the 50s, 60s, when it was called Chanel for Men, those are outstanding. So I can concede ground where necessary, right? Older Egoist is always better. Older Chanel Pour Monsieur is always better. Older Allure Homme is always better. But with Antaeus, there's an argument there. And the existence of Antaeus Sport, which is sadly discontinued, But the existence of Antaeus Sport is proof that a lighter version of Antaeus was what people wanted, because Antaeus Sport came out and it was lighter, it was smoother, and it was fantastic. It's a shame that you can't really buy it now, because I feel like if it still existed, it might sell pretty good, because it's exactly what people want. So the new version of Antaeus is the closest we're going to get to Antaeus Sport without spending like $500 on a bottle of it if you find it somewhere. But there it is. And then we're going to do some quick fire ones at the end. Some not talk about as much, but some that are arguably better. The new version of Jiki, the one recently released, that was a reconstruction by Thierry Vassa. So the story goes, the original Jiki formula was never meant to be super animalic. The civet was always just a part of the musk compound that pushed the other materials, and it was very well blended and smooth. But as with most reformulations over the years, the reformulations never get based off of the original. They get based off of the previous formula. Don't know if you guys know this late in the video. If you're not completely angry and wanting to murder me by now, I know some of you have already signed off and you're trying to figure out my address and you're going to show up by my front door with like a hatchet or something. I get it. But don't know if you know this, but a lot of times when they reformulate a fragrance, they go off of the previous formula and not the original formula. So Jiki became subject of what's called formula drift. Say it with me, folks. Formula drift. And formula drift is exactly what happens when you have a fragrance that is literally 145 fucking years old. You have 145 plus year old formula, and you're going to experience something along the lines of formula drift, where every iteration is based off of only the previous. So it just moves over and distorts over time. Like when you take a cassette tape and you make a copy, and then you copy the copy, and then you copy that copy. Over time, the sound gets more distorted. So that's what happened to Jiki. And the last few batches of Jiki, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the civet was very powerful, and the notorious poo-poo smell that Jiki had, where it was real fecal in the opening, a lot of people were like, man, this literally smells like shit. Quite literally smells like shit. And people didn't like that. So Thierry Vassa took it upon himself to go and get the original formula. The Osmotec helped with that. Jean Carleo helped with that. And they basically restored Jiki. And the new restored Jiki is way less animalic than the previous B bottles. And that is an improvement, because that is closer to how it's supposed to be. And I have proof of that, because one of my readers, one of my generous, lovely readers, sent me a literal antique bottle of Jiki, X-Ray, the little quadrilo bottles. It only had maybe this much in the bottle, so I've got maybe 20, 10, 20, it was a 1 ouncer, so I made maybe a third of it's left or something. And the Jiki in that antique quadrilo bottle is much smoother and way less animalic than the Eau de Parfum and Eau de Toilettes that I have, the B bottles. The B bottles are way more rakish and way more musky smelling than that antique vintage specimen is much smoother. And the new one in the Les Legendaires bottle, the new one that Thierry Vassa made, actually smells closer to that X-Ray that I want to say 1920s. This is from the 20s to 30s. The new bottle smells a lot closer to that antique bottle than the most recent ones before it do. So I can vouch that Jiki was never supposed to be a giant shit monster. It became a giant shit monster because of formula drift. So there's another reformulation that is, for most people, superior to the original. If you like the older ones, the musky ones, That's fine. I mean, again, I have them. I like them too. Same could be said of Caron Pour Un Homme. There was a period in the late 70s, early 80s where Pour Un Homme became very musky. It got double, triple dosed on the civet, became very, 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 very poo-poo smelling itself. But then Richard Frace took over the house and fixed that and made the more modern bottles that we know now, and they smell closer to the original formula than those 80s bottles do, which is why you can go online and get those 80s plastic cap spray bottles for cheap, because nobody wants them. Nobody wants them because they're really musky. They want the lavender, the tonka, the vanilla. They want the classic structure of the original. So they're going to pay for the modern bottles. They're not going to go deep vintage and grab the really old ones from the 30s and 40s. They're going to grab the modern one. And that middle phase, they're going to skip over the middle phase because they don't want that, right? And then, of course, I've already talked at length about Coros, how Pierre Bourdon was given an opportunity to slightly revamp Coros in the 90s and dial back the Cineroma Animalis. Some of you like those Ritz bottles, those early Charles the Ritz bottles, because of how strong they are. I understand. Again, I feel like it's better, more balanced fragrance after the 90s going forward. Maybe not the most recent ones. The L'Oreal ones are questionable. But if you've got the middle ones, the YSL Paris ones, or YSL Prestige Beauté, or the PPR ones, those are good. Those are good. Okay, guys, that's it. That is when reformulations are improvements to the originals. If you have any fragrances in your collection that you feel like were made better with reformulation, let me know in the comment section. We can talk about it. And like I said, if you're seething and your blood is boiling and you're about ready to have a stroke or something because I'm like taking your family's name in vain or whatever by talking about vintage perfume, I'm just going to ask you to step outside, you know, maybe breathe into a bag or something, whatever you got to do to calm down. It's just smelly water, and we're allowed to have opinions. This has been the Unlist. Thanks for watching.